This is like a short story that I like to start all of these sessions with. This is a story, as the title says, about perils faced by at-risk youth, and you know, there's a this is usually how we're used to seeing presentations, whether it's from students, whether it's from our faculty, whether it's from entrepreneurs, and this is not storytelling. This is just you letting your audience read or me reading things at you. And this is not storytelling, this is not pitching. And I like to start here as a base point because it just illustrates all the things that we've been told over and over again, that if you have a big title, if you have an image, if you have bullet points, that makes a slide deck look good. And I have all of those elements, but you can clearly see this is a bad example for how you don't want to design a deck or a presentation or a pitch. And so and if you actually took the time to read through all of these bullets, which I'm sure some of you are doing, you will understand and hopefully guess that at the end of this is actually Wizard of Oz, the story. And the way the words have been phrased that are so jargon-like, that have been taken out of context so much, you completely lose the story in trying to sound smart and trying to follow like these so-called rules that everybody keeps talking about when designing things, especially decks and pitching and storytelling. And that's what I want to show you, all the things not to do in one slide. And honestly, like, storytelling is important because stories are like these little itty bitty ideas that start off as sparks that are so delicate, that start off in our heads, in the ideas, in the heads of people around us. They're so fragile when they start off that they need a lot of like love and nurturing. And if you can manage to capture some of that magic that stories tend to have in that nascent form, you know, your idea could actually become something off the world, that lives in the world, that's independent of you, and that doesn't need that kind of nurturing anymore. And so all of this pitching is all about storytelling. It's about how do you inspire in people the same love for what you have about your idea, and how they could probably see a world where that idea lives and becomes part of that world. And so we'll start with content. So the first piece is, how do you even figure out what the different pieces are that need to go into your story? A lot of people forget that storytelling is about who the audience is, because how you tell Wizard of Oz to a crowd of, you know, 6-year-olds is going to be extremely different from how you present Wizard of Oz on stage on Broadway or on a movie screen. And so people tend to forget that it's not about me, the entrepreneur. It's not about me, who I'm talking to. This presentation, even this one that we're sitting in right now, it's all about you. I want to understand what you're thinking. I want to understand who you are as students, where you're coming from. I want this to be relevant to you. And so we tend to forget that we are not the heroes of what we're talking about. I think it was Keelan who was talking about the climax and the hero's journey and the problem. You know, before you even get there, you have to understand that your audience is who matters, because if the audience changes, how they relate to the hero will change. And you have to be able to capture and start with that. So when you're thinking about your content, when you're thinking about your story structure, you have to start with who is it that will care about your message, about your story. So make it all about the audience, point number one. And then once you know the audience is, you have to then start plotting the lines to figuring out what the big idea is. What is it that you want them to care about? That should be point number two. And so you can't get to the hero without understanding the fact that the audience is what is the hero. If you think that the hero's journey is about your customer, right now, for your audience to thrive and your audience to embrace your idea, they have to be the hero in the story. The arc of the story is them moving through not knowing and not understanding and caring about your product or idea, to the other side where they understand and they care and they want to embrace your idea. So that's the story arc that you want to go through, and move them through. And people make this mistake all the time. People walk into rooms where they don't know who the audience is, who they would be meeting with. That's where I would start every single time. Who are you going to meet with? What is their interest in showing up to this conversation? What are they expecting? And how do you help them care about what you're doing? It's not about you. You don't show up in that picture, in that thinking at all. It's all about who is receiving and listening. So people who said audience, listener, you guys are on the right track. Kudos to you to start thinking about this already. So audience is always key. And then the way I like to start thinking about all the different pieces of that big idea that I want my audience to care about is by putting tons and tons of sticky notes on a wall. There's no filtering at this point. You just want to get everything that's in your head about your audience, about your idea. Just get everything onto as many stickies as you want, and then just stick them on the wall and look at them. And again, a key here, if you can limit one item, one idea, one thought to a stickies, write them with like big expo markers like these guys so that they actually are visible for you to stand far away enough and look at what it is that you're creating, the content that you're generating. That's what would be amazing for you to start just with, like that brain dump of everything that's living in your head, all the assumptions that you're making about your audience. Start with that. And so there's way more that we can get into content, like how do you start thinking about the audience? How do you segment them? How do you start thinking specifically about reaching that audience? But big points, make it about the audience. Think about how do you make them care about your idea. That's where I would want you to start with when thinking about storytelling when it comes to a pitch. Having said that, next I want to talk about the structure of how do you organize this content? How do you start thinking about what that arc of that journey, the hero's journey, if you want to call it that, would be? And to go back to Keelan's point, you wanted to become like a climax thing. Like how do they see the world with your product, with your idea in it as being the only way out, right? Like that's the ultimate goal of making them care. How do you get them there? All right, so with that, I want to move to structure. A lot of you already asked amazing questions about structure. And actually, I'm going to jump like a couple of slides ahead here and tell you who you need to look up in order to understand like the structure of great talks. So like I said, we don't have enough time to do 5-hour sessions here. So I'm going to point you to resources that you should absolutely look up. Nancy Duarte is one of them. So remember the Duarte firm that I was telling you at the top of our talk as inspirations and guides that I pulled a lot of this content from. She is phenomenal. So she spent a lot of time mapping talks that have been outstanding talks. So think Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, think Steve Jobs unveiling the iPhone. She has mapped all of these talks and in fact has a theory around like what is a structure for your story arc and your storyline that can create a lot of tension that brings users back into the mix. And so I highly recommend that you look up her TED Talk. Specifically, she talks about this tension between what is and what could be. So you have to contrast a little bit of what the world is without your idea and what it could look like with your idea. And Keelan's point of, what is it the future look like where that product, that climax that you're building toward. And she has a lot of great points that she talks about, both that tension between the what is, what could be, how do you move the hero of your journey, the audience, through that structure with that tension. You give them a little bit of what is, how do things look like now? How do things look like in the future? And with that tension, kind of move them through that story arc. So phenomenal speaker herself. I highly recommend that you look her up. And then I did want to start with just helping you think through what kind of different medium we have in terms of relaying our content. So for example, one of our different media we have is you and me talking this way, where I'm presenting to about 40 people at the same time. But we tend to use the same artifacts to do a lot of these things, and it's not always a good idea. So what do I mean? For example, you have a document that looks like a lot of text and maybe a headline. We read research papers, newspapers all the time. That's what people tend to do on their own time, right? Like that, presenting a document to you right now is not a very good use of about 45 to 50 people's collective time. And then think about, the teleprompter version of this, where there's a picture, there's some bulleted points, there's someone standing in front of it, and they're reading out what's written on the slides. Now, I call that teleprompter, even though a lot of people use slides this way, where all of what they're going to say is already on the slides. I call it teleprompter because that's exactly what it is. You're using it to prompt what you have to say, and you're forgetting again the audience who is also reading and seeing everything that you have to say. Again, this is a horrible use of about 50 people's collective time. Now, what we can do is use something that is more visual and actually talk about presentations, right? So that's what I want to start helping you think about, is in your pitch, you might need, depending upon the audience, depending upon the situation, a document that is a leave behind, and a presentation that you're actually live standing there and walking a room of either customers, investors, or partners through. And I forget who mentioned the STAR method, but apply the STAR method, the situation and the circumstances, understanding that to your audience and what you've been asked to do, and your content and how you deliver changes based upon that. And I'll make a small separate aside. There will be situations in which you have to have a presentation and then leave that behind for your audience to dig into the details, read more of, learn more of, something that we call a leave behind. I think of them more as like slide docs. So think of these as like your textbooks that have both the detailed version, and then they also have something where it's more visual, where it's more graphic. So as you're thinking about creating your pitch decks, your presentation decks, think about what kinds of different contexts in which you will be using them, and can you use one or more of these different ways to create the content that you want to create for the audience that you're trying to address. So just wanted to say a little bit about that, give you the heads up to look up Nancy and her talk on the structure of great talks. I won't be able to even do any justice to how well she walks you through the hero's journey and how to move through those arcs. So I will leave you guys to do that follow-up after.